I have told this story to my son exactly once on the evening of his 16th birthday, when he asked me how things were before his mother came. I am going to tell it again now because a man ought to get it right before he gets too old to remember every detail, and because there are some things that deserve to be set down straight. It was November of 1881. The worst November in the Valley's memory, as it turned out, though we did not know that yet on the morning they walked up my road. I was working the east fence line when I saw them, 3 of them, a woman and 2 girls, the oldest maybe 9, the youngest closer to 5. The woman was carrying a flour sack over one shoulder and what I took at first for a bundle of rags, which turned out when they got closer to be a 3rd child, a boy, maybe 18 months, asleep against her collarbone, head on her shoulder, wrapped in a man's work coat that was 3 sizes too big for him. They were not dressed for that morning. The girls had shawls over cotton dresses. The woman had boots, but the sole of the left one was separating at the toe, and she had wrapped it with something, a strip of cloth, maybe a flour sack, to keep it together. She was walking carefully in the frozen mud, picking each step. I set down my wire stretcher and walked to the fence. "Ma'am," she stopped. She had the look of a woman who has been walking long enough that stopping is a deliberate choice rather than a reflex. Not fear. I had seen fear on the road enough times to know it. This was something closer to economy. She had no energy for fear, and what she had left was being allocated very carefully. She said, "I heard you might need a cook." I had put a notice up at the trading post in September. The last woman who'd kept my kitchen had gone to Laramie in August to marry a dry goods man, and I had been eating out of cans and what I could manage over an open fire since then. I had not seriously expected anyone to answer the notice. The ranch was 14 miles from town, and the road in was bad. I said, "Who told you?" "A man at the trading post, Harlan Briggs. He said you were a fair man." Harlan Briggs was my farrier and had been for 12 years. I made a note to thank him. I looked at the 3 children and the baby, and the split boot and the flour sack. I said, "Where are you coming from?" She said, "Sutton's Creek," which was 11 miles east. She had walked 11 miles in November mud with 3 children and a baby, because she had heard there might be a position. I said, "When did you last eat?" She said, "Yesterday morning," in the same tone she'd said everything else, even factual, not asking for anything. I said, "Come inside." Her name was Clara Marsh. Her husband had been a homesteader on the Sutton's Creek flat. He had died of a chest sickness in the spring, and in the 6 months since, the homestead had been reclaimed by the land office for back taxes, and she had been living on what her neighbors could spare, which had been generous in summer, and then had stopped being generous when their own winters came. She told me all of this at my kitchen table while she ate, in a voice like she was recounting weather. The girls ate without talking. They were both dark-haired and steady-eyed, like their mother. The boy woke up when she set him down and looked at the kitchen with the abstract interest of a child who has seen enough new rooms to know that new rooms are normal. I watched them eat and felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have words for at the time. I have words for it now. It was the recognition that some things cannot be left the way they are. I said, "The cook's position pays $12 a month, room and board. There's a small bedroom at the back of the house that you and the children can take." She looked at me over the rim of the coffee cup. She had dark eyes, and they did not miss much. She said, "You didn't advertise for a woman with children." I said, "No, but that's what came, and what came is what I need." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't take charity." I said, "I know you don't. I've been eating out of cans since August. The kitchen's a disgrace, and I need someone who can cook and keep the house. That's a fair exchange." She thought about it. She had, I would come to understand, a particular way of thinking about things. She did not rush it, and she did not shortcut. And when she arrived at a decision, she had genuinely arrived there by her own road. She said, "All right." The winter was the worst in memory. I will not overstate the case. It was not dramatic in the way of stories, with a single blizzard and a single crisis. It was the slow, grinding kind of cold that comes in November and does not leave until March, and that wears people down by accumulation. Clara was not worn down. She ran my kitchen the way she did everything, without waste, without performance, without complaint. She had opinions about how a house ought to be kept, and she kept it that way, and she had opinions about what children ought to eat in winter, and she saw to it, and she had opinions about my habit of skipping breakfast to get to the fence line earlier, and she addressed those opinions directly and without much room for negotiation. The girls, Nora and 9 and 5, had the run of the house within a week. The boy, Thomas, could be found attached to my leg by the middle of December with a regularity that became, I discovered, something I looked for. He did not say much. He mostly watched things. He had his mother's eyes. I am not describing a romance. I am describing a winter. The two things are not the same thing, and I want to be clear about that. What happened over that winter was something quieter and more durable than a romance. It was the gradual recognition on both sides that the world made more sense with the other person in it. She knew, I think, before I did. Women of that kind usually do. There was an evening in February when we were both in the kitchen after the children were down, and she was mending one of Nora's dresses and I was doing the books, and I looked up and found her watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not a question, exactly, but something adjacent to one. I said, "What?" She said, "Nothing. I was just thinking you're not what I expected, is all." I said, "What did you expect?" She said, "A man who needed a cook." I said, "I do need a cook." She smiled. It was not the first time I had seen her smile, but it was the first time she let it reach her eyes without checking it, and I set down my pen and closed the books. I asked her in March, when the first real thaw came and the mud returned. She said yes. She said it the way she said things she had genuinely decided, without rush, without qualification, without the particular hesitation of someone not quite sure. She had thought it through by her own road, and she had arrived, and that was that. We were married at the end of March by the same preacher who had married my parents 30 years before, in the same room, with the same set of witnesses, because they were the ones I could reach. Nora stood very straight in a dress Clara had made from flour sacking and a piece of blue wool. May fell asleep during the vows, standing up, leaning against my leg. Thomas sat on the preacher's boot for the duration and seemed satisfied with this arrangement. That is the story. My son is 31 now. He looks like his mother, dark eyes, and the same way of thinking about things that does not rush and does not shortcut. He asked me that evening on his 16th birthday if I had loved her when she walked up the road, and I told him the truth, which was no. What I had that morning was a fence to fix and a bad November, and the recognition that some things cannot be left the way they are. The rest of it came from the winter, and the kitchen, and the way she looked up from her mending on a February evening with something adjacent to a question. That was enough. That was more than enough. It has been in every way that matters exactly enough.